Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for attending this session and welcome to the session on realizing one market for Africa. Unfortunately, we have been informed just a few minutes ago that President Bongo Ondimba from the Republic of Gabon will not be joining us on this session, but we're going to have an exciting and interactive session with my distinguished panelists. May I introduce our topic for this session, realizing one market for Africa. Now, the African Union has committed to setting up a continental free trade area by 2017. Is that achievable, given the fact that 90% of Africa's trade is external and Africa controls only 3% of the global market share? So how can Africa's leaders, how can Africa's business communities, how can Africa's governments develop long-term and sustainable partnerships to ensure that Africa's market share on the global scene, Africa's market share intra-Africa is increased? May I welcome now my distinguished guests for this session. Ms. Arancha Gonzalez, she's the Executive Director of the International Trade Center. Ambassador Liu Guijin, he's a former special representative of the Chinese government on African affairs, and he's from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the People's Republic of China. Ambassador Michael Froman, he's the U.S. Trade Representative. Mr. Siyabonga Gama, he's the Chief Executive, Transnet South Africa. And Tarek Sultan Essa, he's the Chief Executive Officer and Vice Chairman of the Board of Agility from Kuwait, and he's also the co-chair of the World Economic Forum on Africa. Ms. Gonzalez and gentlemen, welcome to this session. Ladies and gentlemen, we're also going to be taking your questions midway through this session. And also for you who are sending in your questions via webcast, watching us on webcast, our hashtag is global trade. Arancha Gonzalez, I'm going to start off with you for this session. Given that Africa's share of the global market is only 3%, and Africa's 90% of her trade is external, in terms of boosting intra-Africa trade, in terms of boosting Africa's trade on the external market, what's being done? Where are we with that whole situation of creating a continental free trade area by 2017?
Well, a lot is being done. We just need to make sure that what is being done is in the right proportions. A lot is being done by architects and engineers. You know, the big guys that build the construct, that build the concept, that is going to make trade possible. But below the engineers and below the architects, we need the plumbers, we need the painters, we need the carpenters. So it's not just about big visions. It's not only, it is, but not only about understanding what's the end goal, but it's also taking all this myriad of little obstacles to trade. That is what's preventing today Africa to trade more, starting with itself, huge potential not exploited, and then also take advantage of their location to export with the rest of the world. And the big name of the game in that respect is called non-tariff barriers. Tariffs today are below 5%, but non-tariff barriers can cost businesses up to 40% of the value of the trade they are trying to trade on. So it's about building the big infrastructure, the big vision, the big agreement, but it's also making sure you get the carpenters, the plumbers, and the painters to do their job. And with that, you would have done 50% of the work. That's what makes trade possible. But you still have to make trade happen. And for that, in my view, it's about investing in supporting small and medium enterprises in this continent, supporting women in business, the 50% of our economies that are untapped, assets that we can leverage much more towards this goal of boosting the trade of the continent.
Before we come to Africa's intra-Africa trade, let's look at Africa's partnerships here. And China and Africa trade has skyrocketed over the last 10 years, Ambassador Liu there, and China-Africa trade is now standing at something like $300 billion here. What is it that has made China skyrocket in terms of its trade partnerships with Africa? What is driving that?
Well, I think in the past 20 years or so, China's bilateral trade with Africa as a continent has been growing at quite fast speed, a double-digit speed. But unfortunately, due to the impact of the big commodity prices dropping and the international financial crisis, so that space of growth between China and Africa in trade has been slowing down in the past 2 years. Last year, it dropped something around 19%. That is not due to the fact that China reduced its import from Africa. It's mainly due to the dropping of the prices of big commodities. But anyhow, China has been remaining as Africa's biggest trade partner since 2009 and still remains so. And China, the government has launched the program which we call Trade and Investment Facilitation. So China is sincere to come into that kind of partnership. And while we will stress trade, particularly stress on the innovation of the trade, say cross-border e-commerce, that would be a kind of new growing point. And another point is that the government will encourage the entrepreneurs from China and the manufacturing factors to move into Africa so as to create jobs for Africa and to make African goods more value added and to make enhance Africa's capability of producing more competitive goods and commodities which can be exported to the outside world. So that kind of partnership is so very important.
Right. Michael Froman, I'll come to you with the US-Africa trade here, and I'll take a look here at AGOA. AGOA trade peaked in 2008, and it was at about $80 billion. It has sort of been in a steady decline since then. 68.2 billion in 2011, 43.1 billion in 2012, 34.8 billion in 2013, and 23.2 billion in 2014. Why the slight decline?
Well, most of that decline is in fact the decline of our purchase of oil from the continent because we're producing more oil ourselves. So we're importing less oil, and of course there's been a decline in oil prices. We tend to look at the impact of AGOA not on oil and mineral exports, which aren't really affected by AGOA, but we look at the non-oil, non-mineral exports, which have quadrupled under AGOA since 2000. It was about 16 years ago this month, I think, that President Clinton signed the AGOA legislation, but a lot has changed since then. A lot has changed in Africa in terms of its growth and the diversification of some of its economies, its demographics, spread of technology. A lot has changed in terms of its trade relationships with itself, as you mentioned, on regional integration, whether it's the growth of the regional economic communities, the tripartite free trade area, or the work towards a continental free trade area, but also Africa's trade relations with the rest of the world, including its EPAs with the European Union. I think one thing we've learned over the years is that trade preferences, tariff preferences alone are not sufficient, that we need to look at the whole ecosystem, including the supply side constraints. And that's one reason we put such emphasis on things like trade facilitation and our work with the East African community and Trademark East Africa on trying to reduce the costs of transporting products from farm or factory to market. It's also one reason we put emphasis on Power Africa. It's hard to manufacture if you don't have reliable, affordable sources of electricity. So we're trying to look at the whole ecosystem and not just the trade preferences side. Having said that, we're now looking to think about what happens beyond AGOA, beyond unilateral preference programs. How do we move towards more permanent, reciprocal relations? And does one do that with one country at a time, or with regional economic communities, or with the continent as a whole? Are there ways that we can pursue this in a way that supports Africa's own economic agenda around regional integration, or value-added production, or increased manufacturing, and make sure that we're incentivizing reform? And that's one of the things that we're here to talk about, is to get feedback from Africa, from business leaders, from political leaders, from leaders of regional economic communities about how they see our bilateral trade and investment relationship evolving.
Mr. Gama, there, you're in the pipeline, you're in roads, you're in building infrastructure in South Africa, looking at infrastructure that can support intra-Africa trade, looking at infrastructure that can support regional trade. Where are we with that infrastructure that can support Africa's trade?
Thank you very much, and good evening to everyone. Yeah, I think from an infrastructure perspective, what we are seeing in Africa is really the lack of interconnectivity. We want to try and see how we could debottleneck from a logistics perspective by making sure that the missing links that we have, we can actually begin to build bridges, we can build railway lines, we can build much more efficient ports so that we can begin to make sure that we can accelerate the rate of trade. So infrastructure is very, very important as a catalyst to create economic growth. Infrastructure is important to make sure that we can debottleneck and release quite a lot of the minerals and commodities that we have, because Africa is a mineral-rich continent. However, these blockages are actually a constraint, and these are part of the supply side constraints that we have in terms of making sure that we can boost intra-African trade.
Right, Tarek, Sultan, though, a recent survey from your organization of over 1,000 logistics company executives showed that the top 4 problems in emerging market economies are customs procedures, corruption, bureaucracy, and poor infrastructure. In terms of Africa, though, how huge is the challenge, and what can be done? What improvements need to be made to surmount those challenges?
Well, I think the first thing is to focus on how big is the opportunity. And I think when you talk about a 10 to 30% GDP growth dividend that would come from trade simplification, the opportunity is tremendous. So, and I frankly believe it's the low-hanging fruit that can really unlock the potential of Africa, and in particular the SME segment. 9 out of every 10 new jobs in the emerging markets are coming from the small and medium-sized enterprise segment. And that segment of the economy is the one that's most sensitive to bureaucracy and ease of doing business issues. And basically, by maintaining an environment that is not as easy to do business as we would like, I think we basically are consuming the medicine that we need to drive the engine of growth going forward. And we talk about the 4th industrial revolution. That revolution will not take place if we don't take the steps to actually simplify and make our countries an easier place to do business. And what are the 2 things that I think that we need to focus on? First of all, we have to develop the capacity and the technology for change. And we need systems that can actually help manage processes and simplify an electronic superhighway for trade facilitation. And maybe sort of a way to look at this is to say, how is it that governments typically focus on trade facilitation? If you go to a meeting about trade facilitation, you usually have 20 or 30 people from each government in a room. And the reason is the supply chain is controlled by so many different stakeholders in each economy that the capacity to change is almost non-existent. So I think we need a minister for the supply chain in each country, and we need them to meet and to be empowered to actually make some of these changes.
Right, Arancha, Gonzalez, I want to come with you though with the comment that was made at this forum in the past couple of days, and several people have been asking, Africa is talking about trading with itself, but what exactly will Africa be trading with? Does Africa have what Africans need? Without the processing aspect of it, what will Africa be trading in internally?
Well, Africa has what it needs in order to trade with itself. It may not be all that it could have, but it certainly has a lot that is not exploiting today. Africa produces in this continent cotton. Africa spins the cotton into thread. The thread is woven into fabrics. I know this well because the International Trade Center that I head has a big weaving operation in Burkina Faso and Mali. Africa has manufacturing of clothing. I was just talking to one of these manufacturers who has operations here in Rwanda and in South Africa. But what Africa needs in order to make this value chain work is deal with the myriad of little problems that hinder the passages of all these components, which is the notion of international trade today across borders, as well as the supporting infrastructure. But this is also happening in Africa. Take the East African community. These value chains are working in East Africa. Why? Because they have decided to go granular and take these obstacles to trade, give ministers a screwdriver to start locking and unlocking the nuts and bolts that you need to make this work. Let me give you a very concrete example. In East Africa, they've done away with roaming charges. Actually, they've done it faster than Europe has done it. And as a result of that, there is an explosion in data and voice transmission. And as a result of this, the IT sector that is very active in Uganda, in Rwanda, and in Kenya is finding amazing new opportunities. So this is happening, and there are places that are moving faster than others. So it's just bringing all of this to scale that is necessary at this point.
Yes, Michael Froman.
Just to add to that, because I think Arancha is right on point there. Textiles is an area that is taking significant advantage of the AGOA preferences to the U.S., but it's mostly cut and sew operations here. We're now seeing, for the first time in places like Ethiopia and elsewhere, companies coming in and investing and beginning to build out the backward supply chain. And it may not go all the way to cotton yet, but as Arancha says, all the elements are here. And if they can build out the supply chain and make sure that they have logistics in place to be able to get the pieces back and forth across these borders, they can capture a higher percentage of the value, and that's what the focus should really be all about.
All right, Tarek, Sultan?
Yes, I mean, our company in particular is focusing on those sorts of solutions. In particular, we've recognized that companies and SMEs, what do they need to basically do business? They need power, they need secure environment, and they need modern facilities. And it's really pretty straightforward. If you can put those facilities in place, it's amazing the results that you see overnight. You see small businesses basically not having to incur the risks and capital expenditures associated with taking these large projects on themselves. They can simply plug and play into this space, and overnight they have an effective way to grow their business. So that infrastructure and sort of having clusters of infrastructure and can really make a big difference, and the multiplier is huge.
Right, Mr. Gama.
Yeah, I just wanted to come in and add that I think that the development of regional value chains at that level of granularity is actually quite an important aspect in terms of building from the bottom up. Because Africa is a continent of 54 countries with many borders, and I think those borders themselves become constraints. But if we start to say, let us look at an integrated planning and development framework per region and look at what are the core competencies and competitive advantages that each of those countries have, and begin to specialize in those. And then say, if you take some of the minerals and some of the core skills that are there, how do you build up? But make sure that there is political leadership, there is agreement in terms of what is the kind of way that can assist to debottleneck quite a lot of the constraints that are there on the continent. So probably we need to break Africa down and not look at it as the 54 countries, because I think it's like trying to head too many chickens. 54 is just a huge number. But if you started to look at it, in terms of the different regional blocks that have been formed, and then as you create this Continental Free Trade Area, which is going to give Africa scale and make sure that it creates a bigger market. But start from the bottom up and look at what constraints are there per region, and then start to resolve them and identify the 3 or 4 key constraints and focus on them. instead of trying to do too many things at the same time.
Right, and I'll still stay with you, Mr. Gama, there, because you talk about identifying the regional economic communities. But that identifying the regional economic communities was actually a precursor to that Continental Free Trade Area. What is the strength, though, of these current RECs?
I think there is different levels of success in terms of the different regional blocks. There's the SADC in the south, there's the East African community, we have COMESA. But I think what seems to happen is some of them have got very good capabilities in terms of the secretariats that run them. But you can't really run these things from a secretariat. What you need is political leadership and decisiveness in terms of who is going to do what. And I think the leaders need to come together, fueled by inputs from business and from those who understand the markets, to say, if we were to reposition, if we are to make sure that we grow this intra-African trade, right, if we are to make sure that Africa becomes self-sufficient, what are the kinds of decisions that need to take place? But also you've got to bolster this with adequate capital and research to make sure that we can begin to move forward, because ideas are not in short supply. What is in short supply is a bias for action. What is in short supply is ability to implement. So it's about execution capabilities. You can dust off a number of reports that have been commissioned, right, around these issues, but we've done nothing. We haven't moved that much. So the key question is, do we have a bias for action? Do we have the implementing authority in terms of all of the people that we've given the task to do some of this work?
Michael Froman, I'm going to come to you in just a moment, but first, yes, Ambassador Liu.
Well, I think the African leaders have been talking about the common market, the integration of African countries' market for quite many years, and they have worked out a lot of overall plans, and they started from sub-regional, efforts first, and then gradually for a kind of continental free trade area. But I don't think the implementation of those, brilliant plans or strategies have been that strong. I think they need to, further enhance the capacity of implementation and to remove not only the tariff barriers, but also some of the psychological or practical kind of differences among different regions and different countries of the African as a continent. So that's why they've been talking for so many years, but the percentage of inter-Africa trade remains as it was some years ago. It's something around, no more than 15%. The overwhelming majority of the trade in Africa was with the outside world. I think they need to show more political willingness and do more work in implementing the plans they worked out.
And we're going to be putting that question to Africa's leadership, but not on this forum today. Michael Froman.
Well, what I was going to say very much is in line with Ambassador Liu and Mr. Gama. Thomas Edison, the famous American inventor, said, vision without execution is hallucination. And we've had a lot of vision, and now we need execution. And regional integration is difficult, and multi-party free trade agreements are difficult, and it really requires political level leadership to set the tone and set the timetable and make sure that all the alignment is there on those who have to execute.
Arancha, Gonzalez.
I want to give a signal that there are places in the African continent where this is happening. So let's recognize what is happening and let maybe emulate or learn from what is happening. And I see in what is happening, again, for example, in this region, in East Africa, a combination of factors that make for a successful implementation of regional integration. One is very clear top-down leadership and vision. But this is not enough. Again, vision without execution is not, we don't go very far. There is also a lot of bottom-up. It's businesses and a good dialogue between the public and the private sector to make sure that the real issues that matter for the private sector get addressed by the trade policy makers. And three, the third ingredient, extremely important, monitoring mechanisms. I mean, I know for a fact that the presidents in East Africa summoned their East African ministers or ministers for East African integration to say, okay, you said you would do this, have you done it? And this is how you make progress. Top down, bottom up, and monitoring.
Let's hear from the private sector. Tarek, Sultan.
Well, I think part of the challenge is, that at least in Africa, is that we look at customs as an organization that develops revenue for the government. And I would argue that if we could change the way that we think about customs and trade and change it to a model that is actually managing processes between partners in a frictionless electronic way, I think we'd get a lot further in terms of GDP development and growth than we would by the revenue that we're giving up from customs. So I think we need to think about what it is we're trying to achieve. We don't need new border stations. We need frictionless borders where there's an electronic system that's actually minimizing the friction and the way that goods move between countries. If we can do that, then I think that the capital and the talent and the sort of entrepreneurs here in Africa will have plenty of opportunity to invest locally. I don't think the solution is for external capital. I think there's plenty of capital here that needs to be put to work, but it will never get there if we can't make it an easier place to do business. And you'll see, obviously, if we're able to achieve this, you'll see that the numbers, the inter-African trade will increase dramatically. And that's the low-hanging fruit. So we've got to change the way that we think about customs and trade facilitation to meet the sort of demands of this fourth industrial revolution.
All right, and I'm sure members of the audience have questions for my panel. Can we get any questions at this point? Yes.
My question is in relation with the sustainable trade relation, and is for Mr. Gama. What is the role of the Pan-Africa Parliament to introduce legislation in cooperation with the national parliaments in order to see things working? I mean, without legislation, we cannot do anything. And since now the Pan-Africa Parliament is there, but without power, decision making, is something is like a mine full of diamonds, and we don't get the diamonds from this structure.
Right.
Thank you.
Mr. Gama?
Yeah, it's always interesting to look at legislation, but I think legislation needs to be enabling legislation. We do have a Pan-African Parliament, but I'm told that it will be fully functional by 2028, which is a little bit further down the line from now. What is important is can they create standards that would harmonize everything across the continent? Is there political will that would make sure that you create a borderless continent where everybody agrees that the continent itself and the trade amongst the people in the continent is much more important than singular sovereignty in each of those countries? Because I think you will find that as you legislate, there will be many agendas and there will be many interests which are sovereign interests, which sometimes plays far above a continental agenda. So it becomes very important that there's that top-down vision, but that then there are resources which are then set aside to make sure that that vision can be achieved, and you make sure that each and every country can actually bring in its own pound of flesh in terms of making the vision of a continental free trade area possible. You would see, for instance, that in a number of the blocks, the trading blocks, if you look at SADC, which is the one that I'm most familiar with, it has things have evolved over time where people have agreed on what will be the key focus areas such as communication, tourism. So you need agreement amongst the political leadership in terms of what it is that you need to do, and then legislation can come in, but you can never legislate the hearts and the minds of people into doing things. You need an entrepreneurial flair to actually try and assist, and I think the legislatures can just assist in terms of standardizing and harmonizing and making sure that there's a common set of standards. But amongst 54 countries, that will be a painful process.
Right, Michael Froman. Right, let me just come back now to the panel here, and the whole question of opportunity, because Tarek, Sultan, you talked about there is opportunity on the continent in terms of increasing Africa's market share. Let me start off with you, Ambassador Liu there. In terms of increasing Africa's market share from a Chinese perspective, what is it that Africa needs to do?
Well, I think personally that they need to further integrate the continent. Should be done by 3 dimensions. One is that infrastructure, because only by developing quite good infrastructure so that you could reduce the transportation fee or facilitate the trade, not only within Africa, but between Africa and the outside world. And another, connection is, to connect Africa, as a common market, that is from political aspect of things. We just not touch on this issue. And the third thing is the theme of this forum, that is connecting the continent by digital transformation or by internet, by e-commerce, cross-border e-commerce. That would be regarded as kind of soft infrastructure development. So if those kind of things could be done, Africa's opportunity of increase its trade volume with outside world and within the continent to have a big share, would be more real, and the future would be more bright. So that would need a kind of we call PPP arrangement, public and private partnership, and that kind of partnership could be internationally from Africa, individual countries, the sub-regional organization and the regional organization, the African Union, to have partnership, real partnership on equal basis, on a kind of win-win arrangement with the outside world, with its main trade partners like China, United States of America, Europe, or Japan, or some of other emerging markets.
Right, Michael Froman?
Well, I think as Arancha said, we shouldn't ignore the fact of how much progress has been made and how many good stories there are out there, including right here in Rwanda, and the kind of progress that has been made on the economic front here. As Ambassador Liu says, there's a great opportunity here. You've got technology, you've got the ability to leapfrog here in Africa some of the legacy issues that industrialized countries have had to deal with, whether it's on mobile banking or e-commerce, or the ability of farmers to be able to access information about their commodities through technology. I think dealing with the supply side constraints broadly defined, the issues around infrastructure and electricity, the issues around how to meet standards of other markets around the world, whether it's sanitary and phytosanitary standards or other standards, and developed countries being willing to play a role in helping that, dealing with the broad issues of trade facilitation that need to be dealt with to make it more efficient. You know, today I was talking about the coffee grown here in Rwanda, and how when coffee is shipped from Rwanda to global markets, it may cost a multiple of what it costs to ship coffee from Colombia to those same markets. So Africa's competing in a global marketplace, and we need to find ways of it becoming more competitive by dealing with all those supply-side constraints so that it can have success.
All right, Tarek, Sultan, to make your work easier on the continent, what do you need?
I think goods and services need to flow through customs more efficiently and with less friction. If we can get that done, if we can achieve that one thing, I think we would solve or laid the seeds of the future sort of industrial revolution and for the benefit of that industrial revolution to manifest itself here in the continent.
Arancha, Gonzalez, you did talk earlier about there are many positive stories that are coming out of Africa. There are many countries or many communities that are doing well on the continent. In terms of examples of a country or a regional economic community or a trading bloc that has gotten it right in terms of infrastructure, in terms of policy, where would you point that to?
Well, rather, I'm going to only take half of your question, Beatrice, if you allow me, because I want us to look at the risk of sounding a bit classical, to look at agriculture. This continent has more than half of its countries are net food importing countries. But when I look at trade in agriculture, only 17% of trade in agriculture in Africa is with other African countries. So we've got a huge potential called agriculture, which today is seen, in my view, too much as a subsistence agriculture issue, and the potential of transforming this agriculture into agro-processing or industrialized agriculture. And this is where technology, this is where services, this is where the digital economy that we are discussing here is extremely relevant. It's also going to have a huge impact in terms of poverty reduction, because a lot of the most poor are in rural communities. And many of them, by the way, are women. So we have a virtuous circle to make if we focus on agriculture. So I suggest we start a hashtag here that says, agriculture is cool, so that we put a bit of the spotlight again on agriculture. To end with an example, we work in Tanzania on spices. Before, the farmer used to sell the spices to an intermediary that sold the spices to the retailer, who then packaged, got the value added, and captured the rent. Guess what happens if you empower that farmer that is producing spices to package the spices and sell to the end consumer? 40 times increase in the revenue for the same spices. That's what I call transforming the potential of agriculture in the African continent.
I'm going to open up the floor to questions now. Can we have some questions? Yes, at the front here. We have one microphone here and one microphone at the back, please.
Thank you. Ahmed Ussi from Brookings in Washington. I just have a question about financial integration. Although we trade a lot with China, most of our trade is in US dollars. And among African countries, when we trade among ourselves, it also has to go through correspondent banks in the US. Could you have your views on how to improve integration of trade, but also financial integration? Thank you.
Right, we'll take one more question at the back. Yeah.
Thank you very much. My name is Wamkele from South Africa. Let me start by thanking the panelists for their views. Just 2 points really that I would like comments on. First is to pick up on what Arancha just said on agro-processing. If we continue to experience the type of barriers to trade that are in some developed countries, how do we expect the agro-processing, the exporting by African farmers? If you look at cotton, look at leather, the minute you start processing leather and export it, it attracts high duties. Same thing in cotton. So as much as we talk about industrial base, deepening the industrial base in the continent, I think we also have to look at the types of barriers that many developed countries still maintain. Secondly, I would also agree that there is a lot of progress that is being made in terms of regional integration in the continent, market integration, and infrastructure development. It takes time, as it has been acknowledged, But I think there has been, from the highest political offices in the continent, there has been a very clear instruction that the continent has to move that direction. It took the EU over 50 years to get to the type of economic and regional integration that they have now.
Right.
So I think it will take us time too. Thank you. So just comments on those points.
Tarek, Sultan, I'll start off with you there on that whole question of integrating the financial systems, the first question, because you operate across borders generally.
Well, clearly, I think the integration of our trade system, to me, is more important. I mean, the spice producer who has a 40% uptick in his value added, wouldn't it be great if he could also sell his spices in all of the other adjacent countries or around Africa, and to be able to operate that business in a frictionless way? The multiplier then is 40 and then times another 50. And that's how I think that's the low-hanging fruit that we need to focus on. I mean, the financial integration, I think, over time, I think it's improving and increasing. But for us, the more relevant integration that needs to take place is between trading partners within Africa, and we need to basically simplify that process because it's going to create jobs and opportunity.
Right. Is this a major, yes, Mr. Gama?
I think also, the concept of the customs duties and import duties that Tarek talks about is an important aspect, because if you don't have a singular protocol which makes the whole of Africa the market, where you then eliminate all of these barriers, and you do away with any protectionist policies that there may be, then you'll start to trade much faster, where you don't look at the collection of customs duty as a revenue earner, but you look at the multiplier impact and effect that is caused by the acceleration of trade. When you hear this example that trade can grow up to 40 times as a result of liberalizing those economies. So I think it becomes important to then say, what are the 2 or 3 key things that ought to be done? Because some of them might not be about creating a new infrastructure. Some of them might be about how we liberate our minds to do things differently. So maybe the bishop wanted to legislate, so we could probably look at what are those common protocols that can be targeted as low-hanging fruit that would assist the acceleration and then make people's entrepreneurial spirits begin to be stimulated.
Right, Michael Froman.
I just wanted to, in response to the gentleman from South Africa's question, just tell a story, which is that this morning I went to visit a cooperative about 45 minutes from here. 172 women run the cooperative. They produce high-quality leather handbags and other products for Kate Spade that are sold in the US, in the UK, and elsewhere around the world. And it's a true story of how AGOA and the global value chains really work. The hides, many of the hides originate in the United States. They're sent to Asia for processing. They're imported here to be put together and to be decorated with 170 women who are now making a living for their families, usually supporting 4 other family members, and then they're sold in the US as a final product. What's interesting is, first of all, it's interesting talking to the women. A woman named Claudine who has 2 kids, who because of this job can now send, her kids are able to get a much better, they have health care, they're able to go to schools better, not have to work. What's interesting is that the inputs and the output for that cooperative are transported by air. The imports from Asia come in by air freight, and the output to the United States and to Europe goes by air freight because it takes so long and it's so difficult to get products to in and out by freight, rail, by ship, by truck. And to think about how much more could be done at that cooperative and cooperatives like that if those other costs were taken out of the system, that's where there's a real opportunity.
Right, Ambassador Liu?
Well, yes, with regard to the financial facilitation in the trade between Africa and countries like China, so far as I know that in December last year during the FOCAC summit, China-Africa Cooperation Forum, our government has put forward 10 major China-Africa cooperative plans. One of them is financial cooperation, and part of that plan is that we are going to make bilateral arrangements with African countries, starting from big market African countries, on a kind of arrangement that a part of the trade could be done through the local currencies, including renminbi. But that would be a kind of a gradual process. We have started that with South Africa, Nigeria, Zambia, and a number of countries. So our U.S. colleague don't have to worry that the U.S. dollar's dominant role will remain there for quite a few years to come. And also that kind of arrangement as a new development bank within the BRICS framework and other kind of initiatives will be followed up to facilitate China's trade with the emerging market countries.
Right. There was a question. Yes.
I had a question around talent, human capital. I think you discuss everything else, but possibly we also heard that the largest young people in the world available to work is in this part of the world. I don't know if it can be solved across the continent, but maybe in smaller pieces. What can be done in terms of East Africa? You heard of connectivity, leveraging talent, some initiatives around creating some centers of excellence and putting a strategy around talent development for the region. And also, how do you leverage all those impact sourcing initiatives of large corporations in the world? They come and spend a lot of money in corporate social responsibility activities, but that's not directed towards creating talent for employment.
Right, Arancha, Gonzalez.
Yeah, I like a lot the model where the corporate social responsibility department of the company has been mainstream across the company. I like it when companies see that their business, they are doing business, can also help do good. They don't need to have a do good department. Now, of course, this means that when you source, that when you buy, that when you sell, you look at from whom you're sourcing, from not just from which country, but also the gender of the person from whom you're buying. For example, if you want to do more women's economic empowerment, that you decide to put a bit more gender in your value chain, or that you decide to do a bit more sustainable value chains, by the way. So I like the model that understands that you can do business and do good at the same time, because the two are not incompatible. And in this space, there is obviously a big collaboration in the area of skills development. The talent is there. I mean, one of the biggest assets that the African continent has is young people. Every generation is more educated and better educated than the preceding one. Of course, there is still a lot of work to be done in terms of schooling boys and girls. And in making sure that their skills are adapted for the labor market. But I would agree with you that there is a bigger space for business to contribute to skills development in a manner that will help the skills connect back to the market.
Right, Mr. Gama?
Yeah, I think the issue of skills and skills development and capabilities is important. But in order for one to do justice to that, the notion of understanding where the key trade corridors and what are the kinds of skills that are required is an important prerequisite in terms of understanding the kinds of skills needs that you'd want. So when we talk about this concept of an integrated planning and development framework, one has to then say also, when we articulate what kind of specialization is required, you can then begin to say what kind of center of excellence do you create in which cluster, being driven by the kind of trade clusters that are there, which are occasioned by the competitive advantage of each of the regions and the countries that you have. Africa is not, just a continent where everything is the same everywhere. There are places where we are still grappling through the second industrial revolution. There are places where we are grappling through the third industrial revolution. There are places where there is absolute finesse in terms of being involved in 3D and the kind of fourth industrial revolution sectors that the OECD countries are talking about. So as you look at that, you then also need to make sure that you've got the appropriate skills mix that talks to what are the patterns of development that need to be traversed in order for us to be able to move forward in terms of that as well.
Right. Michael Froman?
Well, when President Obama was in Africa on one of his trips, he made it clear that he thought it was important that we not just be focused on taking resources out of Africa, but investing in human resources in Africa. And programs like YALI, the Young African Leaders Initiative, there are now thousands of YALI participants across Africa and alumni of that program. And there is no more impressive group of people that I've met in the world in terms of young African leaders in business, in government, in civil society organizations. And that gives you great hope, not just the numbers of the demographic opportunity that Africa has, but the quality of the leadership that they have and what that means for the next generation. And whether it's through initiatives like that or the entrepreneurship summits that we've been having in Africa and elsewhere around the world, I think there's a real opportunity to make sure we're exposing the up and coming leaders of Africa to the best practices around the world so they can take full advantage of the opportunities that have been identified here.
Tarek, Sultan, this does relate to you though in the private sector because how much input or how much effort does the private sector or do multinationals on the African continent? I mean, what's their involvement in training, in the skills training, the talent transfer here on the continent?
I think it differs from company to company, but I think the real idea is that the talent is here. The talent, I mean, of course, there can always be more investment in education, more investment in entrepreneurship, but let's be clear, the talent is here, you can see it, you can feel it, we just need to get out of its way. And we get out of its way by, again, making this an easier place to do business. The talent will itself take advantage of those opportunities and really be able to develop their own destiny by especially leveraging these new technologies that are coming out. And a one-man entrepreneur with a proper supply chain system and access to a computer can do a lot of good damage in this new industrial age. And we just have to just enable that. And of course, when it comes to training, we have to be, part of that and develop, our employees to the extent possible. But we have to start by recognizing that the talent is there, and we just have to get out of its way.
Right. I'm going to take one last set of questions before we end the session. Yes.
Yeah. I have a question to Mr. Froman and the trade agreements the US has recently signed with Asia and is currently negotiating with the European Union. And the question is, and there are thoughts that these trade agreements might impose threats to the trades with Africa, as the signing parties will then focus to strengthen trade between each other at the expense of Africa. Can you comment on that?
Sure. I don't think there's any contradiction between the two. Right now we're trading with Vietnam or we're trading with Bangladesh as we're trading with Africa. I'm just picking the area of textiles as one area in particular. Africa has duty-free access to our market in leather goods, as the gentleman asked about before, and a wide range of textiles. Bangladesh and Vietnam currently don't, but they all export products to the United States. And I think our goal is to make sure that all countries are having the opportunity to become more and more competitive, have more and more value-added production so that they can take advantage of access to our market. But I think you're putting your finger on something that's quite important, which is that the global trading system is changing. Africa is having more trade agreements amongst themselves and with other parts of the world. We're having trade agreements with other parts of the world as well. that the preference programs themselves, the tariff preferences themselves, aren't enough to ensure competitiveness of product coming out of Africa, and we all have to be diligent about thinking about what the next generation of trade relations should look like, how to deal with the broader ecosystem, how to deal with the supply side constraints, and how to create potentially some more permanent, more reciprocal kinds of relations that send a message to the markets about Africa being a place to invest.
Right, there was a question, the lady at the front here.
Yes, thank you. Thank you to the whole panel for great insight, really. I would like just to make two comments mainly. To the point made by Ambassador Froman, just the story, the anecdote shared, Kate Spade. And it is true, they are doing a fantastic job. They are producing really goods that can trade all over the world. However, the cost of transport remains very high. What is it that it will take to be able to attract more investment in big infrastructure projects, cross-border infrastructure projects? Because we've done quite a lot in EAC, as was clearly articulated by Arancha. We've done quite a lot, but what we are meeting with what we are facing today is that, well, it is quite easy easy, it is relative, but to get to the one network area, harmonizing our regulations and making sure that really we slash down all the roaming charges. But then we move from that. We went to one single tourist visa. And with that one single tourist visa, we were able to make this region become one single tourist destination. And we have seen in that great increase in terms of tourism. We have been able as well to remove the need for any passport among the citizens of this region. Today, people are able to move with an ID, with a student card, with even a voter card. So we've been able to do that. And through that, we've seen that we are able to have really free movement of people across border and free movement of skills. Coming to the point of skills, the strategy that we are taking today is to be able to really bring all these high centers of excellence, and in Rwanda, such as Carnegie Mellon University, avoid having to send East Africans, young East Africans far away, but rather bringing the expertise here and having them trained here. And we are able to apply to provide scholarships at the same conditions. And the big but is that when it comes to cost of doing business, that is about the big infrastructure project. It is about power connectivity lines. It's about the standard gauge railway. So what is it, Ambassador Froman, Ambassador Liu, what is it that it will take for governments such as yours, from private sector coming from your countries, what is it that it will take? What do they need to see, to be able to invest, to come on board? We are building bankable projects. What is it that they need to come on board on these projects?
Gentlemen.
Well, I think, for the Chinese government, really we have done quite a lot in the past, say, 10 years or more in infrastructure development here, by investing and by contracting and by cooperation with the African governments. But yes, as we know that from China's experiences, that there are three constraints. Normally, as bottlenecks for the further development of developing countries like China and African countries. Well, that is infrastructure and finance and skill for people, technology. In this area, the new focus of the government through its overall cooperation plans with Africa, with the continent, is that we will do more. Put more financial resources. For instance, something around $5 billion within 3 years as what we call official development assistance or cooperation, that is interest-free and or grants. So most part of those money would be, facilitating, skill development, human resources development, and education development. So China has done a lot and has put forward an ambitious plan of what we call 3 networks, or 3 connections and 1 industrialization. That is to connect Africa by railways, by highways, and by regional aviation links. But to facilitate those projects, that the government also commits to build, within some time of 3 years, 5 universities or colleges devoted on training, personnel or technologies with regard to transportation and communication. I think one more thing we need to do is to encourage more NGOs and more private business to come to enjoy that efforts. As you know that private NGO sector in China is not that well developed as in developed countries, but we would like to do something more to encourage more people to come to get on board together with Africa and encourage the Chinese entrepreneurs or business people, or including private investors, to behave better in performing CSR, corporate social responsibilities, not by making money for themselves, but to contribute to local development and to the grassroots people, and to benefit people more directly.
Right, Mr. Froman.
I think the question underscores very much how much meaningful progress has been made in places like the East African community in a number of those respects. But there's much more work to be done. And it's hard infrastructure of the sort that you mentioned, whether it's highways, or railways, or very importantly, power and electricity. But it's also what we would call soft infrastructure, the kinds of things that our colleagues have mentioned about making the systems work more smoothly, having the ports be more efficient, making sure that when something gets cleared at the port, it doesn't get stopped multiple times when it crosses a border within the East African community, where it's not supposed to have to pay additional customs fees. Getting rid of those official and unofficial roadblocks to lorries going from one country to another. So there's a lot more work to be done, I think, to deal with the transportation costs. And I think there was work to be done in terms of just climbing up the doing business indicator has mentioned. I think the bad news is that there's an awful lot of sub-Saharan African countries at the lower end of the list of doing business in Africa. The good news is some of the countries that are most improved at those measures are also in sub-Saharan Africa. So it is possible with good political leadership and the necessary political will to take on those kinds of issues and make it more attractive, to attract not just investment in that one cooperative, but to get to that at scale for countries like Rwanda and elsewhere.
Very interesting insights, and I'm going to get a final comment from each of you, and if you can just limit your comments to less than 2 minutes or 1 minute, that would be great. So, Arancha Gonzalez, I'll start off with you. To realize one market for Africa, going away from this forum, the most urgent issue that needs to be addressed to realize one continental free trade zone, to also increase Africa's global trade. What needs to be done in one word?
Translate plans and visions into action and start yesterday. That's what's needed. 1 minute.
All right, Ambassador Liu.
Well, I think true partnerships with outside world and a kind of strong public and private partnerships inside African countries.
Right. Mr. Froman?
Well, I guess I'd say success breeds success. And so showing what's positive that's going on here, trying to scale it up, working with your partners outside of Africa to do so, and then I agree with everything Arancha said.
Mr. Gama.
I'll take a bit of her minute.
You could take some of mine too.
Yeah, great. I just wanted to say that, before you even go to China and the US, if you want to build a railway, you talked about a railway and you got a bankable feasibility study. We do a lot of that work as well here in South Africa, 3 or 4 hours away. So I'd like to make that offer of that cooperation to assist also. But I think to answer this other question, I think if we could do a little bit more in terms of vertically integrating our economies. I think we could realize quite a lot of value. And also look at moving away from just looking at primary commodities and begin to beneficiate some of these and add a lot of value. I think that would also be a giant step forward. So looking more into manufacturing and not just exporting raw materials. That will take us a step further.
Right. Tarek, Sultan?
Speed and urgency of these reforms. I mean, these are things that we need to be doing now, and we can't wait. It's that simple.
Right, yours is very quick. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us in this session. May I also thank my panelists, Arancha Gonzalez, she's the Executive Director of the International Trade Center. Thank you very much. Ambassador Liu, thank you very much for being on the program. Michael Froman, Siyabonga Gama, and Tarek, Sultan, to you all. Thank you very much for talking about realizing one market for Africa. And thank you very much, members of the audience, for participating in this. This wraps up this session, and goodbye.